Summer, 1973. Memphis baked under the kind of heat that drove people indoors, leaving only a few restless shadows drifting along empty sidewalks. Outside, a record shop, a girl of 11 sat cross-legged on the concrete. Before her lay a row of handmade drawings, colored pencil sketches, faded watercolors, paper edges curled by the sun. A cardboard sign, letters uneven but desperate, read, "For Mama's treatment." Some passers-by glanced and kept walking. A few tossed coins, their pity as quick as their footsteps. Most didn't stop at all. The girl's face was weary, but her chin stayed high, her eyes fixed on the street, as though sheer stubbornness might turn paper into medicine. Then the low purr of an engine cut through the heat. A black Cadillac Fleetwood brougham slowed, its chrome flashing. The window rolled down, and in the driver's seat, unmistakable even without the smile, was Elvis Presley. But this wasn't the glittering figure from the stage. He didn't wave or laugh. He just looked at her, long and steady, as if something in her small world had struck straight through his own. That moment, on an almost empty Memphis street, would change everything. The late afternoon sun pressed down on the cracked sidewalks of Memphis, the kind of heat that seemed to shimmer in the air and make every step slower, every breath heavier. On the corner of a modest street, not far from a row of small grocery stores and shuttered shops, a girl sat cross-legged on a square of faded cardboard. She could not have been older than 10. Her brown hair clung to her forehead with sweat, and her dress, though neatly washed, had grown pale from too many scrubs in too cold a basin. In front of her, a handful of sketches were spread across the ground. They were simple drawings, done in pencil and cheap watercolors. A tree bending in the wind, a soldier standing proudly with his rifle, a little house surrounded by flowers that only existed in her imagination. The paper was warped at the edges from humidity, some corners already grayed by dust. She had no sign, no explanation written out, just the pictures. Passers-by hurried along, glancing once, then twice, then moving on as if guilty for looking at something they knew they wouldn't buy. A few paused long enough to smile at her effort, but the smiles never turned into coins. The girl didn't beg, didn't chase after anyone. She simply sat there, waiting, her knees drawn tight under her chin when she wasn't sketching another picture on her lap. Inside the small house just a few blocks away lay her mother. The illness had come suddenly and settled deep in her chest. The doctors said her heart was failing, and every week she seemed smaller, her skin more translucent, her breath more shallow. The medicine helped only enough to keep her alive, never enough to let her walk the room again. Their income, what little there was, came from a widow's pension, barely enough to pay rent and keep bread on the table. Her father's face stared back at her every night from a photograph on the dresser, a young man in uniform smiling stiffly, proud in his olive-green jacket. He had been sent to Vietnam, and he had not returned. The folded flag from his funeral lay in a wooden box that her mother kept wrapped in a cloth, too painful to look at, but too sacred to hide away completely. So the girl had decided to do what she could. She had always liked to draw, scratching images with stubby pencils on the backs of grocery lists, sketching shapes in the condensation on window panes. Now it had become her only weapon against despair. She sold her drawings for pennies, for dimes, sometimes nothing at all. She told herself that if she sold enough, perhaps she could help her mother breathe easier. The world, however, had little patience for a child's hope. On the third day of her sitting at the same corner, a man in a wrinkled suit staggered by, irritated by the sun and his own troubles. He glanced down, sneered, and with the edge of his shoe scattered the pictures across the pavement. "Who'd pay for this nonsense?" he muttered, shaking his head as he walked on. The girl's eyes burned, but she said nothing. She bent down quickly, gathering the sheets before the breeze carried them away. Some had smudged where his heel had dragged across, but she stacked them again neatly and placed them before her. Her small hands trembled, though she held them still in her lap, waiting. The traffic roared and hissed along the street. A bus groaned to a stop across the way, filling the air with fumes. A cluster of teenagers laughed as they passed, too absorbed in their own world to notice hers. And then, just as the shadows of early evening began to stretch across the road, a low, polished hum broke through the noise. A Cadillac, sleek, spotless, its chrome gleaming, slowed as it reached the corner. The girl looked up briefly, then lowered her gaze again. Cars like that never stopped here. They belonged to another world, one where curtains were heavy, and meals never came from ration stamps. But this one didn't glide past. Its engine eased into silence, and the door opened. For a moment, no one moved. The girl clutched her drawings, ready for another scolding or careless laugh. From the corner of her eye she saw a pair of boots step onto the pavement, followed by the crisp line of tailored trousers. The figure paused, as though deciding whether to turn away or continue. And then, instead of moving on, the man stood there quietly, looking down at the fragile little gallery laid out on the sidewalk. It was not a place one expected to see someone of his kind. He could have kept driving, could have rolled past without ever noticing the child hunched over her sketches. But something had pulled him to the curb. The sun caught the side of the Cadillac, sending a blaze of light across the dusty sidewalk, a strange contrast against the worn colors of paper and cardboard. The girl lifted her eyes just once more, uncertain of what she was seeing. She could not have known then that this single pause, this unlikely halt on a sweltering Memphis street, was about to change everything. The man stepped forward, and the quiet thud of the car door shutting behind him seemed to hush the noise of the street. A couple of bystanders, curious at first only about the Cadillac, now lingered at the edges of the sidewalk. Their eyes widened when they recognized who had just emerged. Yet he paid no attention to them. He wore a dark jacket despite the heat, his shirt open at the collar, a faint glint of gold resting against his chest. His hair, jet black and carefully combed back, caught the sun. For a moment, he seemed almost unreal, as though he had stepped out of a movie screen onto the pavement. But the man did not strike a pose or wave to the gathering crowd. Instead, he lowered himself slowly onto the curb, close enough that his boots brushed the edge of the girl's cardboard square. The girl froze. No stranger had ever sat beside her like this. Not here, not in this way. His voice, when it came, was low and unhurried, softened by the hint of a southern drawl. "These yours?" he asked, nodding toward the scattered drawings. She blinked, then gave a quick nod, not trusting herself to speak. "They're good," he said, picking up one of the sheets carefully, as if it were something fragile. "Real good. You sellin' them?" Finally, her words stumbled out, small but steady. "Yes, sir. For my mama. She's sick." The man's expression changed. It was subtle. His smile tightened, and his eyes shifted, focusing more deeply. He didn't ask her to repeat herself. Instead, he studied her face, then the paper in his hand again, as though weighing something private against what he had just heard. A couple of women down the block pointed in their direction, whispering excitedly. One of them lifted a camera, trying to capture the sight, but the man glanced up sharply, his gaze firm enough to make her lower it without a word. He turned back to the girl, shutting out the rest of the world. "Why drawings?" he asked. She looked down at her lap. I can't work anywhere else. I can't leave her alone too long. I draw at night when she sleeps. I thought maybe somebody would buy one. Her voice carried a kind of matter-of-fact maturity that sounded strange in someone so young. No pleading, no tears, just an explanation given with the seriousness of someone twice her age. The man held her sketch of the soldier longer than the others. His thumb brushed lightly across the lines where she had shaded the helmet and rifle. Something in his face flickered. When he spoke again, his words came slower, quieter. You lost your daddy? She nodded. In the war. He didn't move for a moment, didn't even breathe audibly. Then, gently folding the paper back onto the pile, he lowered his elbows onto his knees and leaned closer. His voice dropped enough that only she could hear. I lost mine too, years back, and my mama, later on, took the heart right out of me when it happened. She studied him now, puzzled. He didn't sound like the men who sometimes threw coins at her out of pity, nor like the neighbors who told her to give up. He sounded almost raw, as if her words had scraped against something buried deep in him. You're an artist, he said finally, pointing toward the colored page of flowers. Maybe one day you'll paint bigger than all this. Maybe in a gallery, who knows? But right now, you're sitting out here in the sun, trying to hold your mama together. That takes more courage than most folks ever find. She tilted her head. You talk funny, she said, not unkindly. For the first time, he laughed, a warm, rumbling sound that softened the tension. I reckon I do. Still, she did not recognize him fully. She had heard his name whispered by older girls at school, seen faces light up when his songs played on the radio, but she hadn't tied the man before her to those voices. To her, he was simply someone who had stopped, who was listening without rushing her words away. By now, a small circle of onlookers had gathered, their murmurs growing. But for the two on the curb, the world had narrowed. The distant honks of traffic, the shouts of boys throwing a ball down the block, even the cicadas grinding in the heat, all seemed muffled. The girl leaned forward slightly, almost whispering. People don't usually stop. They just walk. The man's eyes softened. Sometimes you gotta stop. You never know who you'll meet sittin' in the dust. And with that, he fell silent. A stillness hung in the air, not uncomfortable, but charged with something larger than the corner of a Memphis street. It was as if both of them knew, without quite understanding, that this moment was not chance, not ordinary. Something had shifted, though neither could name it yet. The man shifted slightly on the curb, balancing the drawing in his hand as though it were worth more than the thin paper suggested. A breeze stirred the dust around their feet, lifting the corners of the other sketches, threatening to scatter them again. He pressed one down gently with his palm, careful not to crease it. How much? He asked suddenly. She hesitated. A dime, or a quarter, if it's a big one. He let out a slow breath, almost a sigh, and reached into the inside pocket of his jacket. The leather of his wallet creaked as he opened it, and he pulled out a fold of bills, crisp, thick, far more than anyone on this block would expect to see changing hands for a child's art. Without counting, he tucked several into her small palm. The money looked strange there, oversized, almost unreal against her thin fingers. That's too much, she whispered. No, he said simply. That's what they're worth to me. For a second, the girl thought it might end there, that he would stand, climb back into the waiting Cadillac, and vanish into the stream of traffic. It would still have been more kindness than she had known in weeks, but he didn't move. Instead, he studied her again, with a focus that made her shift uncomfortably. as though he were searching for something in her expression that only he could see. "I want to meet your mama," he said at last. Her head snapped up. "Why?" "Because she's the reason you're sitting here in this heat. And if she's fighting that hard, I ought to know her name." The girl's brow furrowed. Adults had promised things before. Neighbors who said they would bring food but never came. Officials who filled out forms but forgot her mother's address the next day. She had learned not to trust easily. Now this stranger, whose face was oddly familiar, yet belonged to no one she really knew, was speaking like someone who intended to step inside their fragile life. "What if you don't come?" she asked, her voice barely audible. He leaned closer, lowering his voice until only she could hear. "Then I'd be a liar. And I try not to be." Still, she did not answer. She looked down at the bills in her hand, then back at him. Her silence seemed to demand more than words. Slowly, he reached beneath his shirt and pulled out a small chain with a cross that caught the last rays of sunlight. He unclasped it, held it for a moment in his palm, then placed it carefully on top of her drawings. "This was mine," he said. "I've carried it a long time. If I don't come tomorrow, you keep it. But if I do, then I'll ask for it back." Fair trade. Her eyes widened. She touched the charm lightly, as though afraid it might burn her fingers. It was heavy, real, not the kind of trinket a child found in the five-and-dime store. It smelled faintly of tobacco and cologne, of something older than her years. From across the street, a man raised a camera again, snapping quickly. The click broke the spell. The stranger turned sharply, his voice carrying now, hard and commanding. "Put that down. No pictures." The man froze, lowering the camera as if caught stealing. The bystanders shrank back, but the stranger didn't pursue it. He turned again to the girl, his face calm once more. "This ain't for the papers," he said softly. "It's for you and your mama." She clutched the cross, uncertain, the weight of it strange in her hand. She wanted to believe him, wanted desperately for this not to be another empty promise. But a part of her heart braced for disappointment. The Cadillac's engine hummed to life behind them, a reminder that his world was not hers. He rose slowly, dusting the back of his trousers, then looked down once more. "Tomorrow," he repeated. "I'll be there." And then, without ceremony, he turned and walked back to the car. The door shut, the vehicle rolled forward, and within moments the corner was just a corner again. A girl on a square of cardboard, her drawings spread like fragile leaves, a cross gleaming faintly against the fading light. For the rest of the evening, she kept glancing toward the street, half expecting the Cadillac to return, half certain it never would. The money in her pocket felt heavy, but it was the small piece of gold on her palm that truly unsettled her. Because promises, she knew, had a way of breaking. But this one carried the weight of something different. The next afternoon, the girl waited by the window. Her drawings lay untouched on the table. Her pencils rested where she had dropped them the night before. She had not slept well. The cross he had given her sat heavy around her neck, the chain a reminder every time she moved. She wanted to believe he would come back, but doubt gnawed at her. Men with kind words came and went, and promises usually faded into silence. The heat pressed in harder today, thick and unmoving. The tiny fan in the corner only stirred the stale air, carrying with it the faint smell of medicine bottles lined neatly on the dresser. Her mother lay propped up on pillows, her skin pale and drawn tight across her cheekbones. Even lifting a glass of water seemed to take effort. "Why are you staring out there?" her mother asked softly. The girl hesitated. Someone said they'd come." Her mother's eyes, weary but sharp, rested on her. People say many things, honey. Don't set your heart too high. The girl wanted to argue, but before she could, the distant rumble of an engine cut through the muffled sounds of cicadas. She pressed her face to the glass, hardly daring to blink. The gleam of a familiar Cadillac appeared at the end of the street. Her breath caught. Mama, he's here. The car slowed, then stopped directly in front of their small, weathered house. The driver's door opened, and he stepped out. No entourage, no flashing lights. Only one other man who remained discreetly near the vehicle. His presence filled the quiet street even before he reached the porch. The girl darted to the door, then froze, suddenly nervous. What if her mother thought she had imagined it all? But the knock came, low and respectful, and she turned the handle with trembling fingers. He stood there with the same dark jacket, though dust clung to the cuffs now. His smile was faint, careful, as though he knew how fragile the moment was. "May I come in?" he asked. She nodded, stepping aside. Inside, the air felt heavier than outside, a mix of heat and medicine, and the faint scent of detergent from clothes washed too often in too little water. The small living room held mismatched furniture, a worn rug, and a radio on the shelf that crackled faintly with static. On the walls hung only two pictures, the father in uniform and a faded portrait of the mother from years ago, smiling with more color in her cheeks. Her mother tried to sit up straighter when he entered. She brushed her hair back, embarrassed at her appearance, and managed a polite smile. "You'll forgive me if I don't stand," she said, her voice weak but steady. "You don't need to," he replied quickly, crossing the room and pulling a chair beside her bed. "I just wanted to meet you." The girl hovered near the doorway, unsure whether to sit or hide, until he motioned her closer. She perched on the arm of the chair, still clutching the chain around her neck. He studied the woman gently, his expression shifting from formal courtesy to something more personal. His voice lowered. "My mama passed not so long ago. Her heart gave out, too. I thought I'd never breathe the same after. When I heard about you, I couldn't just drive on." The room fell silent. The mother blinked slowly, her eyes glistening. For a moment, she seemed to see not a famous man, but a son speaking across time. "I don't know why you'd trouble yourself with us," she said softly. "Because I remember what it felt like to lose her," he answered. "And I don't want this little one to carry that so young." He reached for the girl's hand briefly, just enough to let her know he meant it. The girl watched them, unsettled by the intensity in his eyes. She had never seen a grown man speak so plainly, without pride or distance. He was not the figure whispered about at school or the voice on jukeboxes. He was someone sitting in their worn-out living room, knees close to the edge of the rug, speaking as if he belonged there. Her mother's chest rose and fell unevenly, the effort of conversation tiring her. Still, she smiled faintly. "You remind me that kindness still lives. That's worth more than any medicine." He shook his head gently. "Medicine's still needed, and I'll see to that." The words hung in the air, almost startling. He didn't say them with bravado, but with quiet certainty, as though he had already made the decision long before stepping through the door. The girl's throat tightened. She had heard promises before, but none spoken with such weight. She clutched the cross again, the cool metal against her skin, and wondered if maybe, just maybe, this time was different. The room felt suspended, as if time had slowed. Outside, the cicadas screamed and children shouted down the street. But inside, everything narrowed to the three of them: a sick mother, a weary daughter, and a man carrying his own ghosts. That night, long after the girl and her mother had fallen asleep, another house across Memphis refused to rest. The white-columned mansion on Elvis Presley Boulevard glowed faintly in the dark, its windows spilling warm light into the quiet lawns of Graceland. Inside, Elvis paced the length of the den, a cigarette burning between his fingers, its smoke curling upward in restless shapes. He had spent the drive back in silence, ignoring the chatter of his bodyguard who tried to lighten the mood. His thoughts were too loud. He had walked into that small room, seen the medicine bottles, smelled the stale air of sickness, and it had been like stepping into his own past. He saw his mother again, Gladys, in her final months, her eyes sunken but still trying to smile for him. The memory struck him like a hammer. Now, at nearly 3 in the morning, he dropped onto the sofa, staring at the ashtray overflowing with spent filters. He pressed the heels of his hands into his eyes, as if trying to push the memory back down where it had stayed buried all these years. But it refused. That little girl's face, determined yet fearful, had opened the wound again. He stood, walked to the phone on the side table, and dialed without hesitation. The voice of Dr. Nicopolis, Dr. Nick, his trusted physician, answered groggily. "Elvis, you know what time—" "Nick, listen," Elvis interrupted, his tone sharper than usual. "There's a woman here in Memphis. She's sick. Heart condition. I want you to see her. Quietly. I'll cover it all, but no names, no press. Understand?" Dr. Nick was silent for a moment, surprised. Then he asked carefully, "Family? A friend? Number just someone I met? Doesn't matter who. Can you do it?" There was a pause, then a resigned sigh. "If you insist. I'll make arrangements tomorrow." "Tonight," Elvis corrected. "First thing." He hung up before there could be more questions. For a moment, the quiet returned. Then another voice intruded. This one not from memory, but from down the hall. Colonel Tom Parker, his manager, had been waiting. The colonel's bulk filled the doorway as he walked in, his face set in that calculating look Elvis had learned to dread. "I hear you're making plans," Parker said, settling into a chair without being asked. "What's this about a sick woman?" Elvis exhaled smoke, his jaw tightening. "It's none of your business, Tom." "Everything's my business," Parker snapped. "You spend money, it affects the show. You show up in places unannounced, it makes headlines. You want to help someone? Fine. But you don't do it in the dark. We can spin this. Picture of you with the girl, the sick mother, it'll play like a miracle story. Boost your image. Think about the press." Elvis turned slowly, his eyes narrowing. "You think this is about press? About selling tickets?" His voice dropped low, dangerous. "I buried my mama because her heart quit on her. You think I'll use another woman's pain to sell out a coliseum? Not a chance. This stays quiet." Parker's face reddened. He leaned forward, pointing a finger. "You can't throw money away like this, boy. You need me to keep your world running. Don't go making promises I can't manage." Elvis rose, towering over him now, his shadow long across the rug. "You manage the stage, Tom. That's all. You don't tell me who I can care about." The colonel stood, too, fuming, but something in Elvis's expression, steel, raw, and unyielding, stopped him. Parker muttered under his breath, tugged at his tie, and stormed from the room, the door slamming behind him. Elvis dropped heavily back into the sofa. His chest heaved, not from anger alone, but from the weight pressing against him. He wasn't sure how much he could do, whether money or doctors could change what disease had already taken hold. But he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He would not let the girl's trust dissolve into another broken promise. He stubbed out the last of his cigarette, leaned back, and stared at the ceiling. Outside, the city slept. Inside, he began to plan, not as the king of rock and roll, but as a son who once lost too much, and as a man determined that, this time, someone else might not have to. The days that followed moved faster than the girl could measure. One morning, instead of the usual silence broken only by the clatter of her mother's cough, men in white coats appeared at their doorstep. They spoke softly, carried black cases, and treated her mother with the calm assurance of those who had seen such battles before. She did not know their names, nor did she ask. She only noticed that they called her mother "ma'am" with respect, that they examined her heart carefully, and that they brought medicine stronger than the faded bottles already on the dresser. Her mother's color improved slightly, a touch of warmth returning to her face. She could sit upright longer, even manage a smile without losing her breath. For the girl, it felt like witnessing a candle flame fight back against the dark. She clutched the cross at her neck every time she saw her mother breathe easier, convinced the chain itself carried some secret power. But hope has a way of drawing attention. A neighbor, curious about the Cadillac that had parked on their street twice in 1 week, whispered to another. Whispers turned to stories, and soon a local reporter appeared, knocking gently, notebook in hand. The girl shrank back when she saw him on the porch. He asked questions she did not want to answer. Was it true that Elvis Presley had been here? Was he helping them? Could they pose for a picture? Her mother, frail but firm, refused politely. "We are not a story," she said, closing the door with effort. Yet the next day, the small-town newspaper carried a headline anyway. Elvis Presley seen visiting sick woman in South Memphis. The article was brief, more rumor than fact, but it was enough. By afternoon, strangers began to appear. Some stood across the street, hoping for another glimpse of the Cadillac. Others knocked on the door offering groceries, or pressed coins into the girl's hand, as if that would ease the intrusion. Some meant well, others came only for spectacle. Children from the neighborhood crowded the sidewalk, daring each other to peer through the windows. The girl hated it. Her drawings, once scattered quietly on the corner, were now objects of curiosity. People asked to see them, to buy them, not because they cared for the pictures, but because they wanted a piece of the story. She felt the weight of their stares, their questions, and for the first time she wished to be invisible. Late one evening, the familiar hum of the Cadillac returned. She ran to the door before anyone else could notice. He stepped out quickly, this time without even the second man lingering nearby. His eyes scanned the small crowd down the street, his jaw tightening. When she opened the door, he entered swiftly, shutting it behind him. Inside, the air was heavy with tension. He removed his jacket, draped it over the chair, and knelt beside the girl so their eyes met. "Don't let them scare you," he said softly. "They don't know what they're talking about." She gripped the cross, her voice unsteady. "They say we're famous now. I don't want to be." His expression softened. "Fame's a burden, not a gift. Believe me, I know." He glanced toward her mother, who had woken at the sound of his voice. "I wanted to keep this quiet. I still want to. But sometimes the world don't give you the choice." Her mother reached for his hand, her thin fingers resting against his. "We never asked for this," she whispered. "I know," he replied, "and I'll keep it as private as I can. But no matter what they print, what they say, my promise stands." For a long moment, none of them spoke. Outside, the muffled sound of voices drifted through the window, the crowd unwilling to leave. The girl thought of how small their house had always seemed, yet now it felt like a stage she never asked to stand on. Elvis rose, his broad frame almost too large for the modest room. "Let me worry about them," he said. "You worry about each other." But even as he said it, she sensed he knew the storm was only beginning. What had started as a quiet act of kindness was now something larger, something neither he nor they could contain. And still, beneath the tension, a new question pressed itself into the girl's heart. If the world was watching, what would he do next? The newspaper clipping, small as it was, had grown legs. Within a week, the story traveled beyond Memphis. Regional stations repeated it, radio hosts speculated, and by the end of the month, Elvis could no longer step onto a stage without someone whispering about the girl and her mother. It wasn't a headline orchestrated by Colonel Parker, but it became one all the same. In Graceland, Elvis sat at the piano late into the night, fingers moving across keys without rhythm, his voice low, muttering fragments of lyrics he never finished. He wasn't rehearsing a showpiece. He was searching for something else, something truer. The girl's quiet determination haunted him more than the flashbulbs or the rumors. She had reminded him of a kind of courage he had nearly forgotten. Small, private, but stronger than applause. By now, he understood he couldn't shield her family from the spotlight. What he could do was change the way the world looked at them. If people were going to talk, let them talk about resilience, about devotion, not about pity or spectacle. So he made a decision. At his next Memphis concert, he would bring them in, not as a curiosity, but as a testament. Arrangements were made carefully. He sent word to the girl's mother himself, not through Parker, not through an assistant. He asked them to come as his personal guests to the Mid-South Coliseum, a venue that could hold thousands. When he arrived at their home to explain, the mother shook her head immediately. "I can't sit in an arena," she said weakly. "I don't want people looking at me like I'm part of a sideshow." He leaned forward, his voice low and earnest. "This isn't about me singing or them cheering. It's about you and her. People need to see strength like that. You may not feel strong, but she sees you that way. Let the world see it too." The girl held her mother's hand, whispering, "Please, Mama, just once." The mother closed her eyes, her lips pressed together, resisting, but the touch of her daughter's fingers finally tipped the scale. She nodded slowly. On the night of the concert, the Coliseum trembled with noise long before the first chord struck. Lights swept across the crowd, banners waved, voices rose in waves that hit the walls like surf. For the girl, it was overwhelming. She had never seen so many faces gathered in one place, never felt sound press against her chest like a physical force. Elvis had arranged for them to sit close to the stage, in seats usually reserved for dignitaries. She clutched her mother's hand tightly as they were led through the tunnel into the vast arena. Her mother's breath came shallow, but she straightened her back, determined not to let weakness show. When Elvis stepped onto the stage, the roar was deafening. He wore a white jumpsuit, sequined but softened by the weight of the moment he carried inside. His smile flashed for the crowd, but his eyes kept scanning, searching, until they found the two faces he had been waiting for. His gaze lingered, steady and unshaken, even as the music swelled around him. The girl felt the spotlight without it yet being there, the quiet understanding that tonight was not going to be like the others. The air itself seemed charged, as if everyone in the arena could sense something unusual was about to unfold. Her mother leaned close, whispering through her breathless chest, "He keeps looking this way." The girl nodded, her grip on her mother's hand tightening. "He promised," she whispered back. And in that moment, even before he spoke a word, she knew the promise was about to be carried from their living room into the ears of thousands. Halfway through the show, when the energy was at its highest, and the audience expected another hit to roll from the orchestra, Elvis raised his hand. The musicians faltered, horns dying mid-note, drums sliding into silence. The crowd, at first confused, quieted as he stepped forward, microphone in hand. His breathing was audible through the speakers. Thousands of people leaned in, unsure what was coming. He didn't flash a smile, didn't wink as he sometimes did when playing with his fans. His voice came measured, steady, touched with an intimacy that reached even the furthest seats. "I want to tell y'all something tonight. It's not a song, not a story for the papers. It's just the truth." The audience hushed. You could almost hear the squeak of a chair or the shifting of someone's feet on the concrete floor. "Couple weeks ago," he continued, "I was driving through Memphis. Just another day. Nothing planned. And I saw a little girl sitting out in the heat with her drawings spread on the sidewalk. She wasn't begging. She wasn't asking for pity. She was working, trying to do something for her mama, who's been fighting with her heart for a long time." He paused, letting the words sink in. A ripple moved through the arena, surprise first, then something softer. "She reminded me of my own mama," Elvis went on, his voice dropping lower, rougher. "I lost her too soon, and I've carried that hurt every day since. So when I saw that little one, I couldn't just drive on by." The crowd remained silent, hanging on each word. Some had their hands clasped, others wiped their eyes without knowing why. This wasn't the polished stage banter they expected. It was something raw, personal. Elvis turned slightly, looking toward the section near the stage where the girl and her mother sat. He lifted the microphone again. "She's here tonight, and I'd like y'all to see her, because she's the bravest person I've met in a long time." The spotlight operator hesitated, then swung the beam across the audience until it landed on the girl. The sudden glare made her flinch. She stood awkwardly, clutching her mother's hand, her knees trembling. For a heartbeat, the entire Colosseum was silent. Tens of thousands of eyes locked on a child who had never asked for a stage. Elvis gestured gently. "Stand tall, sweetheart. You earned it." The girl rose fully now, blinking against the light. Her mother, pale but proud, squeezed her hand. From the stands came the first sound, soft clapping that grew, spreading row by row until the arena shook with applause. People cheered not for a star this time, but for a child who embodied a kind of courage most of them had forgotten existed. Elvis let the moment swell, his own expression unreadable, then lifted the microphone again. "This isn't about charity. It ain't about fame. It's about love, about what we hold on to when the world tries to take it away. That little girl taught me something I'd been forgetting, that you don't quit on the people you love, no matter how heavy the road gets." The audience was still on their feet, many openly crying now. Some shouted words of encouragement. Others simply stood with heads bowed. The atmosphere had shifted from entertainment to communion, as though the stage had become a pulpit, and the message one of faith, not fame. Elvis lowered his head, his hair falling forward for a moment before he pushed it back. He didn't smile. His face carried the weight of memory, of grief resurfaced. But his eyes, when they lifted again, were steady, fixed on the girl and her mother. The orchestra waited for his cue, hands poised above instruments, but he didn't turn to them yet. He stood in the silence he had created, letting the power of the moment speak louder than any lyric. And then, softly, he said, "This next song, This one's for her mama. And for every soul out there holding on by a thread. The crowd roared again, but this time with something more than excitement. They understood they had just been part of a story larger than themselves, a story carried on the voice of a man who, for one night, set aside the crown of rock and roll to speak as a son, as a witness, as a man remembering the weight of love. The arena lights dimmed again, and the hush that followed was different now. No longer the restless anticipation of fans waiting for another hit, but the charged quiet of thousands bracing for something heavier. Elvis gave a brief nod to the band, and instead of launching into the usual driving rhythm, the first notes that floated into the air were soft, mournful, aching with reverence. He closed his eyes, tilted his head slightly back, and began to sing. His voice was not the polished performance the audience had grown accustomed to. It cracked on certain words, carried a tremor he did not try to conceal. Every syllable seemed pulled from some deep well inside him, the same place where memory of his own mother lived. From her seat, the girl felt her chest ache as though the sound itself had reached inside her. Her mother, too weak to stand, lifted trembling hands to her face, tears spilling freely down her cheeks. She had heard Elvis Presley's voice on the radio many times, but never like this, never so naked, so human. It was as if he was singing directly into the hollow of her lungs, giving her breath for a few moments she thought she'd lost forever. Around them, the audience responded in silence first. People clutched one another's arms, couples leaned closer, and strangers pressed tissues into hands without asking names. The song wove through the air like prayer, binding the thousands together in shared grief, shared hope. By the second verse, sniffles were audible across the vast hall. By the final chorus, tears streamed openly down the faces of men who had sworn never to cry in public. The girl squeezed her mother's hand so tightly her knuckles whitened. She whispered, though her voice was drowned in the music, "He's singing for you, Mama. Just for you." And her mother, eyes closed, nodded faintly, lips forming silent words of thanks she couldn't quite release aloud. When the last note trembled into silence, Elvis lowered the microphone and bowed his head. He didn't shout, "Thank you," didn't strike a pose. He simply stood, breathing hard, sweat glistening on his brow as the crowd erupted. The ovation rose like thunder, yet Elvis didn't bask in it. He turned his eyes toward the girl and her mother, and with a single small gesture, his hand pressed briefly to his chest, he acknowledged them. Then, instead of plunging straight into the next number, he stepped back from the microphone. He let the ovation crash and swell, then lifted his hand once more, not in triumph, but in quiet dismissal. The band stayed silent. The audience, slowly realizing, quieted again until the hall was filled not with clapping, but with something rarer: stillness. It was in that stillness that the power of the moment settled. Thousands stood in the Colosseum, yet no one spoke. No one moved. It was not emptiness. It was reverence. For a mother fighting for breath, for a daughter who would not give up, for a singer who had chosen to bear his wounds before them all. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, Elvis stepped back to the microphone, his voice hoarse. "Take care of the ones you love," he said simply. "That's all that matters." He set the microphone down, turned, and walked toward the edge of the stage. The spotlights dimmed, leaving him half in shadow. For a moment, the vast hall felt like a small church, the audience like a single congregation bound by unspoken vows. The girl pressed her mother's hand to her cheek, tears streaming silently now. Her mother's frail shoulders shook as she tried to steady herself, her face alive with an emotion that was neither pain nor fear, but something brighter, almost defiant. When the house lights came back up and the crowd finally erupted again, it wasn't with the raucous noise of fans demanding more. It was applause mixed with sobbing, with shouts of gratitude, with people holding each other tighter than they had before. As they were led out quietly by ushers, the girl turned once more toward the stage. Elvis had disappeared behind the curtain, leaving only the echo of his voice and the weight of the silence he'd carved into thousands of hearts. She touched the cross at her neck, still heavy, still real, and whispered to herself, "He kept his promise." That night, as people filed out into the Memphis streets, the story they carried home was not about sequins or fame. It was about love, stubborn, ordinary, and extraordinary all at once. And for many, long after the last note had faded, it wasn't Elvis they remembered most. It was the image of a fragile mother, a steadfast daughter, and the way one man's song had turned an arena into a cathedral of silence and tears.